Then she saw her reflection in the ornate mirror across from her and froze. That wasn't her face. Porcelain skin, crimson lips, raven black hair cascading like a waterfall over her shoulders. Eyes that once held arrogance, now wide with terror. Sonaria had read about this woman before, but only in a novel. The villainess, the cold-hearted noble who had tormented the heroine, the one who was publicly executed in chapter 20. A bitter chill crept down her spine. She knew how this story ended. It wasn't just the wrong face in the mirror. It was the wrong life. Somehow, impossibly, she had awakened inside a fictional world. And not just as any character, but the one destined to fall. Memories that weren't hers surged through her mind like a flood. Parties drenched in luxury, cruel laughter echoing through gilded halls, the look of disgust in the prince's eyes the moment he sentenced her to death. "No," she whispered, voice shaking. "This can't be real." But the ache in her chest, the weight of the corset pressing against her ribs, the sound of servants whispering just beyond the door. It was all too real. Panic clawed at her throat. She was supposed to die. No one loved this woman. No one would protect her. Redemption wasn't in the original script. Unless she rewrote it. She clutched the bedsheets, trembling. If she did nothing, she'd be dragged to the gallows like in the book. But if she acted fast, changed the path, made different choices, maybe she could survive. Maybe she could live. But the first rule of this deadly game was clear. Stay away from the crown prince! He was the executioner in her story, and she had no intention of meeting him again. The silence inside the estate was deafening. Sonaria sat alone in the grand study, staring at the golden-framed painting of the former her that hung above the fireplace. Regal, beautiful, cold, everything the villainess had been known for, everything the kingdom had hated. The memory of that woman's execution clung to her like smoke. She could still see the scene from the novel, the jeering crowd, the heavy chains around her wrists, the smug satisfaction in the heroine's eyes, and the cold indifference in the prince's face as he gave the final command. That fate now belonged to her. Her fingers clenched around the edge of the desk as she forced herself to breathe. Panicking wouldn't help. Not now. Not when time was already against her. She needed to think, fast. The story was already in motion. The plot that condemned the villainess was built like a perfect trap. One misstep, and she'd fall straight into it. Sonaria tried to recall the book's early events, dragging fragments from her memory like pieces of a puzzle. Minor feuds that spiraled into scandals, court gossip planted by jealous nobles, a poisoned glass of wine meant for another. And then, the banquet. Her heart stopped. That was tomorrow. The royal banquet was where the downfall had begun. A public confrontation with the heroine, a heated exchange with the prince, a shattered wine glass that splashed on his robes, and with it, the first seeds of hatred were sown. Sonaria stood up, pacing. She had to avoid the banquet. That was simple, logical. Stay away from the crown prince, stay away from the heroine, stay away from the storyline altogether. But it wasn't that easy. This world, this character, it had expectations. She was the daughter of a duke, infamous for her arrogance, her pride, her iron rule over the household. If she changed too quickly, people would notice. They'd ask questions. They'd grow suspicious. She couldn't afford suspicion. She had to play her role, carefully, just not fatally. A knock echoed on the door. Her maid entered, eyes downcast, holding a silver tray. "Your Grace, the palace sent your invitation for tomorrow evening. The crown prince will be in attendance." Sonaria's blood ran cold. So it had begun. The timeline was still intact. The story hadn't changed. She was still on the path to ruin, and now she had less than 24 hours to escape it. After dismissing the maid, she sank into the velvet armchair, the invitation still trembling in her hand. The old Sonaria would have gone to the banquet in a jeweled gown and a venomous smile, ready to claim attention like it was her birthright. She would have insulted the heroine with calculated cruelty. She would have demanded the prince's gaze, whether he offered it or not. And by the end of the night, she would have signed her own death sentence. But she wasn't that woman anymore. "I won't die again," she whispered into the quiet. This time, she would outwit the plot. even if it meant becoming someone entirely new, even if it meant rewriting fate itself. Tanaria had sworn she wouldn't go. She had made up her mind, refused the dress her maid prepared, and told the butler to send polite regrets to the palace. Let the court whisper, let the nobility wonder. It didn't matter. Anything was better than seeing him. And yet, by nightfall, she was standing at the palace gates, wrapped in midnight blue silk and diamonds that weighed heavy against her collarbones. Tanaria clenched her gloved hands inside the folds of her skirt. Her pulse thundered in her ears, drowning out the music drifting from the banquet hall beyond. Why had she come? Because word had arrived just hours before. A message from the queen herself. A direct summons. No excuses would be accepted. Refusing would mean public insult to the royal family. And public insult was political suicide. So now she stood beneath golden chandeliers, surrounded by nobles who smiled too sharply and bowed too deeply, each one watching her like a hawk circling its prey. She moved like ice, graceful, unreadable, untouchable. The villainess, as expected. But beneath the mask, her mind raced. Every moment here was dangerous. She needed to stay silent, avoid conflict, and most importantly, avoid him. The prince. She hadn't seen him yet. Maybe the rumors were wrong. Maybe he wouldn't come. Maybe... The doors opened, and there he was. The crown prince entered the ballroom like a blade. Tall, composed, impossibly elegant in his military uniform, silver trim gleaming under the light. His expression was unreadable, cold. Cenaria felt her breath catch. Her entire body went rigid. That face, the same one that had once looked down at her on the scaffold, the same eyes that had watched her die. And yet, when his gaze swept across the room and landed on her, he didn't look furious. He looked intrigued. She froze under the weight of his stare, her mind screaming for her to look away, move, vanish. But her body betrayed her, rooted to the marble floor. The prince tilted his head, just slightly. A signal. Then, he walked toward her. Panic clawed at her throat. This wasn't part of the plan. He wasn't supposed to notice her. He was supposed to hate her. She had done everything to avoid this meeting, and still, here he was, cutting through the crowd like it didn't exist. "Lady Tsaneria," he said, his voice smooth, unfamiliar. "We meet again." A hush fell over the nearby nobles. Curious eyes turned. Whispers bloomed like wildfire. Tsaneria swallowed her terror. "Your Highness," she said, dipping into a perfect curtsy. Her voice didn't tremble, but her heart did. He studied her, eyes narrowing slightly. "You're quieter than usual tonight." She forced a polite smile. Some nights call for silence. There was a pause. A breath too long, too heavy. Then he leaned in, just enough for only her to hear. "You're different." Tsanaria's blood turned to ice. She held his gaze, refusing to flinch. "Am I?" He smiled, not cruelly, but curiously. "I don't remember you being so composed." Every instinct screamed at her to run, to flee the ballroom, the palace, the kingdom. But instead, she bowed her head and said nothing. Let him be intrigued. Let him wonder. Because if he knew the truth, that she wasn't the woman he thought she was, she wouldn't make it out alive. By morning, the palace was already buzzing. The villainess had spoken to the crown prince, and he hadn't walked away. Tsaneria sat at her vanity, staring into the mirror as her maid brushed her hair into smooth, regal waves. Her reflection was flawless, just like the world demanded. Composed, polished, cold. But behind the noblewoman's mask, her thoughts twisted like storm clouds. The prince had noticed something. "You're different." Those two words echoed louder than any threat. He was watching her now, curious, suspicious. And in a world like this, curiosity was far more dangerous than hatred. She couldn't afford to slip, so she doubled down on the role the court expected of her. The ruthless Tsaneria, daughter of Duke Valaria, noble by blood and venom by reputation. She returned to hosting weekly teas for the elite, her expression as sharp as her wit. She walked the palace halls like a queen without a crown, shoulders square, eyes cold. She gave the court what it wanted, a villainess to whisper about behind fans. But behind the scenes, she changed everything. She ordered the cooks to increase food portions for the servants, but said it was for public appearances. She replaced two cruel staff members with fairer ones, but cited incompetence as the reason. When a maid's younger brother fell sick, Tsenaria paid the healer in secret, letting the girl believe it was charity from the church. No one suspected. They didn't want to. The nobles preferred their villainess to remain heartless. It was easier that way. Easier to fear her, easier to blame her. And so, Tsenaria built her own kind of power in the shadows. Each small act of kindness was calculated, hidden, safe. Because in this world, mercy could be mistaken for weakness. But not everyone was blind. Rumors began to shift. A noblewoman whispered that Tsenaria had refused to humiliate a debutante at last week's ball. Another claimed she had returned a merchant's land after a dispute, with no bribe. The whispers were confused, uncertain. The court didn't know what to believe anymore. And that terrified them. The crown prince watched her from afar. He didn't approach again. Not yet. But she felt his gaze at every gathering, every royal function. Always silent, always searching. He was waiting for the mask to crack. But Tsenaria had worn masks long before she entered this world. The difference now was why she wore them. It began with a single rose, left on the windowsill of her carriage. No note, no signature. Just a perfect white bloom, untouched by frost, as if it had defied the winter itself to reach her. Tsenaria stared at it in silence. In the novel, no one had ever given the villainess a flower. Not even out of pity. She said nothing, burned the rose in her fireplace, told herself it was a trap. But then came the second encounter. At a hunting event hosted by the royal family, she arrived in armor-laced riding leathers, her expression as unreadable as ever. The other nobles laughed behind their hands. The villainess had no place in games of sport, they said. But the prince noticed. He watched her dismount with effortless grace, watched her steady the horse of a frightened child from a distant noble house when she thought no one was looking. Later, as dusk fell and the nobles gathered for wine and praise, he approached. "You ride well," he said, glass of wine in hand. Tsenaria raised an eyebrow. "I don't need your compliments." "It wasn't a compliment. It was an observation," he replied, eyes glinting with something unreadable. "Though I admit, you're not as easy to predict as you used to be." She froze. There it was again, that look. Not hatred, not disgust, curiosity, confusion, interest. She couldn't decide which was more dangerous. "I'm not here to entertain your intrigue, Your Highness," she said coolly. "If you're looking for sport, try the archery field." He took a slow sip of wine, gaze never leaving hers. "I wonder, who exactly are you trying to fool?" The question struck deeper than he could possibly know. She turned away before he could see the flicker of emotion in her eyes. "You should remember who I am." "Oh, I do," he murmured. "But I'm beginning to think you don't." Tsenaria's heart twisted. She had spent weeks building walls, crafting her image, manipulating perception like an art form. But every time he looked at her, it was as if he saw straight through the stone and steel she wore. She couldn't afford this. She couldn't afford him, because the moment she started to believe there was kindness in his gaze was the moment she'd lose everything. Later that night, in the privacy of her manor, she pulled out the old book, the one that had brought her here, the one that still outlined her doom. She flipped to the final chapters. Her execution. The prince's cold betrayal. There was no love story in these pages. And yet, why was he looking at her like he was ready to write one? It began with a name she wasn't supposed to remember. In the quiet of her private library, Tsenaria read through old ledgers and estate documents, desperate to find a way to strengthen her position. But one name appeared too many times, tied to treasury funds, land deals, and quiet disappearances. Lord Maron. In the original novel, he had been a background character, a loyal noble, unremarkable, forgettable. But here, in the real world, he was everywhere. She leaned over the parchment, her brow furrowed. His signature was on documents approving grain shortages in the outer provinces. His men were quietly placed in the royal guard. And worst of all, his influence was growing in the shadows, unnoticed by the court. Something was wrong. Terribly wrong. Tsenaria's hands shook as she flipped through pages, piecing it all together. The downfall of the kingdom, which had been blamed on her in the book, it didn't align. Not anymore. The riots, the failed crops, the theft of military supplies. All of it had already begun, long before the villainess had ever lifted a finger. The villainess hadn't destroyed the kingdom. She had been the scapegoat for the ones who truly did. Her breath caught in her throat. This wasn't just a story anymore. This was a trap. Carefully written, perfectly played. And if she didn't act now, the ending would remain the same. She knew what had to be done. The next morning, she slipped into the royal archives under the pretense of delivering estate papers. No one questioned her, not when she walked like a storm, eyes sharp and expression colder than frost. There, hidden among forgotten scrolls and dust-covered records, she found the final proof. A letter, stamped with the royal seal, forged. It linked Lord Maron directly to a plot to weaken the crown from within, to push the kingdom to collapse and blame Sanria for it. The evidence was undeniable, and the worst part? The letter had been meant for the prince. He had never received it. A trap had been set long ago. She was simply the perfect villain for their story. Sanaria stood in the middle of the archive chamber, heart pounding. If she exposed this, the court would turn upside down. But if she made a single misstep, it would be her neck on the block before anyone heard her scream. And the prince? She still didn't know if she could trust him, but she had no choice. She was no longer just trying to survive. She was unraveling a lie that could burn the kingdom to the ground. The world hadn't noticed the shift in her eyes, but he had. Sanaria moved through the court like a blade wrapped in silk, but inside, her thoughts had begun to splinter. Each glance from the prince chipped at her armor. Each word he spoke, too calm, too curious, left a mark she couldn't erase. He wasn't supposed to matter. He was supposed to be the man who destroyed her, the one who hated her, the one who let her die. But instead, he watched her with something far more dangerous than hatred. He watched her with hope, and that terrified her more than anything. Late one evening, Sanaria stood alone on the palace balcony, the city glowing like scattered fireflies below. A soft breeze lifted her hair, but it wasn't the wind that made her shiver. She felt his presence before he spoke. "I never know what version of you I'll see next." The voice was familiar now. Too familiar. She didn't turn around. "Then stop looking." "I can't." Silence stretched between them like a wire pulled too tight. When she finally turned to face him, the moonlight caught the guarded look in her eyes. "You shouldn't be here, Your Highness." He took a step closer. "Neither should you, if all those rumors were true." Sanaria said nothing. He studied her, not with suspicion, but with something softer, something real. "You saved a merchant's daughter last week. Quietly. Paid for her surgery through a temple donation. The court didn't notice, but I did." His voice lowered. "You aren't who you used to be." Her breath hitched, just slightly. He was seeing too much. She looked away, gripping the stone railing. "You don't know who I am." "Then tell me." His words were gentle, but they struck like arrows. Tell him that she didn't belong here, that she'd once read his life like a fairy tale tragedy, only to wake up inside it, that her every move was a calculated gamble just to survive. She almost laughed, almost cried. Instead, she whispered, "You're making a mistake." He moved beside her, close enough for her to feel his warmth. "Maybe I am, but it doesn't feel like one." For the first time, she looked up at him, really looked, and something in her heart, something carefully buried, moved. She had never meant to fall for him, but hearts didn't follow logic, not here, not now. Still, what if it was all part of the story? What if this sudden tenderness, this strange affection, what if it was just a twist in the script? A temporary illusion to break her resolve before the end? Her fingers curled against her chest. She couldn't afford to love him. Because love in this world always came with a price. And Sanaria wasn't sure if she could afford to pay it. It happened faster than she could have predicted. One moment, Sanaria was walking through the palace gardens, sunlight dancing across the fountains. And the next, the royal guards were surrounding her. "Lady Sanaria Valeria," the captain declared, voice cold and clipped. "You are under arrest for treason against the crown." Gasps echoed through the courtyard. A noblewoman dropped her fan. A servant stumbled back. The world tilted. Sanaria didn't flinch. Not this time. She raised her chin, calm as glass. "On what grounds?" The captain offered no answer, only iron shackles. As they clicked around her wrists, her mind raced. This wasn't a random arrest. Someone had pulled the strings, and deep down, she already knew who. Lord Meron. She had gotten too close. Found too much. The forged letter, the hidden accounts, the quiet rebellion brewing behind the scenes. He had moved first. And just like that, the story was trying to swallow her again. They threw her in the same tower from the novel. Damp stone walls, a narrow window, cold chains against her skin. She remembered this place too well. In the book, the villainess had screamed, begged, cursed the prince's name until the very end. Tsenaria sat in silence. She had fought so hard to change her fate, rewritten her every step, masked her heart, played 1,000 careful games. And yet, here she was, right back where the pages said she would be. A prisoner, a traitor, awaiting execution. But something was different. This time, the guards avoided her eyes. This time, the servants didn't call her names. This time, she heard voices outside her cell. Confused, angry voices. She was helping the orphanage. She stopped the tax raids in the border towns. Why would she try to betray the crown now? The court wasn't certain anymore. The story had begun to split. And yet, the one voice she needed most had not come. Where was he? Where was the prince? Had he believed the accusations? Had he stayed silent? Had everything they shared, the glances, the unspoken words, the warmth she'd tried not to feel, been nothing but another chapter in her tragedy? Her heart ached in the quiet. She had promised herself she wouldn't fall for him. That survival came first. But now, as the execution loomed once again, all she could think was, will he let me die again? The throne room was silent. Not a whisper, not a breath. Nobles filled the marble hall like statues, lined in rows beneath towering stained glass. The royal advisors stood tense, eyes flickering between one another. The queen sat still, her face unreadable. And at the center of it all stood the crown prince. Before him, Tsenaria knelt in chains, head bowed, her raven hair tangled and damp with rain. Her gown, once the mark of noble status, was torn and soiled from days in the tower. But her back remained straight, unbending, unbroken. The prince hadn't spoken since she was brought in. He stood there, not as a man, but as the sword of justice. Lady Tsenaria Valeria, one of the advisors began, you are charged with high treason, conspiracy to undermine the crown, colluding with foreign agents. Do you have anything to say before your sentence is passed? The room leaned in. Tsenaria slowly raised her head. Her voice, though soft, cut through the stillness like a blade. I do not deny I have changed, she said, but not for the throne, not for power. I changed because I saw what this world had become, and I couldn't stand by any longer. A few nobles shifted uncomfortably. She turned her gaze to the prince, steady, searching. I know what this court wants. I know the role you've cast me in, but I won't beg. I won't cry. If this is how the story ends, then so be it. But I'll meet it with open eyes. And still, he said nothing, not a word, his expression unreadable, cold, just like before. Tsenaria's heart twisted in her chest. Maybe she had been wrong. Maybe none of it had mattered. Maybe her kindness, her sacrifices, the moments she allowed herself to hope, maybe they were never enough to change a heart already sworn to duty. Maybe she had always been fated to die. The executioner stepped forward. The verdict was moments away. Then, the prince moved. He raised one hand. The hall froze. Enough, he said, his voice calm, but heavy with something deeper, something raw. All eyes turned. I've read the evidence, he continued. I've listened to the whispers, the accounts, the contradictions, and I've come to one conclusion. He stepped down from the throne, his footsteps echoing through the marble chamber. This woman is not the same Tsenaria Valaria who once played court games for power. The air thickened. No one dared breathe. She exposed a traitor who hid beneath our noses for years, he said. She protected our people when we looked away. And whether we wish to admit it or not, the court is safer now because of her. He stopped just in front of her. And then, slowly, deliberately, he knelt. Before her, gasps rippled through the hall like thunder. He reached for her chains and removed them. Tsenaria stared, stunned. Her lips parted, but no words came. I told myself I couldn't trust you, he said quietly, just for her to hear. But I watched you fight a fate written in stone. I watched you become the woman I didn't know I needed. She felt her chest tighten, her vision blur. You defied your story, he whispered. So let me defy mine. He stood and turned to the court. I will not sentence her. I will not let history repeat itself. The court may question my decision, but know this. Anyone who lifts a hand against her now, lifts a hand against me. The room exploded in murmurs, shock, fury, awe, but Sonaria didn't hear them. All she could hear was the sound of fate breaking. For the first time, the story was no longer in control. The chains were gone, the accusations silenced, the court shaken. And yet, Sonaria didn't feel victorious. She stood on the palace balcony days later, watching the sunrise bleed gold across the rooftops of the capital. The wind was soft, carrying the scent of dew and lavender from the royal gardens. For the first time since she had awakened in this world, no one was chasing her. No one was plotting her downfall. The story was over. But what came after? The crown prince hadn't spoken much since the trial. Not in public, not in private. He'd returned to his duties with the quiet intensity of a man who had just broken his own chains, too. They passed each other in corridors, exchanged glances, shared silences heavy with things unsaid, until one day he found her alone. Not in silk, not in armor. Just Sonaria, barefoot in the gardens, her hands stained with soil as she planted herbs with the servants she once terrified. He didn't announce himself. He just stood there, watching, as if afraid that moving too fast might scare her away. You could have let me die, she said softly, without turning. I know. You could have followed the story, played the hero, wiped your hands clean. I didn't want to be a hero, he replied. I just wanted to do what was right. She looked at him then, really looked, and for the first time, she saw no trace of the man who had once passed a death sentence in the pages of a book. Only a man who had chosen her. Not the villainess, not the version others whispered about, just her. He took a hesitant step forward. You were never written to be loved, but I want to love you anyway, if you'll let me. Sonaria didn't answer right away, because love wasn't a reward. It wasn't a guarantee. It was a choice. One she had never been allowed to make, until now. She reached out, fingers brushing against his. Not a promise, not a fairy tale ending, just a beginning. Months passed. The court adjusted. The nobles whispered less. Some feared her still. Others respected her. Sonaria didn't mind either way. She was no longer living a role. She was writing a life. She opened schools, reformed land laws, protected the weak with the same sharpness she once used to command fear. And when she smiled, it was real. The story the world expected had ended, but hers was just beginning. Not as the villainess, not even as the heroine, but as the woman who rewrote fate with her own hands and dared to believe in a future no one saw coming. A future unwritten,